Thank you, Haley, and thanks everyone for joining today. Looking forward to sharing some of our insights. The research we're going to be talking about today is coming from a new piece that was launched by TBR this year, our infrastructure strategy customer research. So before we dive into some of the trends, I'll spend a minute just kind of explaining what that customer research is and how we executed it. And then we'll look at what were some of those big takeaways across company sizes, verticals, and just overall what were some of the big findings in terms of how companies are looking at their infrastructure strategy today. So a little bit more about this customer research. This was conducted in the spring around the April time frame in the United States. The survey is really focused on helping the IT vendor community, TBR's client base, better understand key trends that are influencing IT buyers in terms of their strategic roadmaps, how their investments are shifting across different types of infrastructure in different places, like their core data centers, their edge locations, their colo environments or hosted environments. So really trying to get a picture of how companies are prioritizing their own infrastructure and the pieces that are owned by the company, less so the public cloud environment. So what are they doing with their own infrastructure today? The research looks at 4 main topic areas. So we looked at overarching macro trends, we looked at infrastructure investments themselves, trends around data center consolidation and cloud repatriation, and infrastructure services needs. So we'll talk about some findings from those overarching areas. One of the great things about this survey was that we were able to get a very good mix across industry segments as well as company sizes. You'll see a great distribution there. We looked at 6 broad vertical sectors, and then we also looked at small, medium, and enterprise businesses. So the first thing that we'll actually do is just kind of talk about how the results differed a little bit looking across this segmentation before we kind of jump into some of the other findings. Because one of the great things about this customer research in the full study is that we were able to analyze every question by these different vectors and see where companies behave similarly with their infrastructure strategy and where there's market differences between all of these. So when it comes to the business sizes, you can see the definitions that we used in this study on the slide here. A couple of just overarching themes to keep in mind as we go through the research in terms of how different business sizes tended to respond to this survey. In the small business area, what we ultimately found in terms of trends for this respondent group was that compared to the larger businesses, their access to fewer resources, which includes staff and budget, was certainly apparent in the way that they answer questions about their infrastructure priorities. It certainly lessens their focus on business transformation because we saw from their responses that these businesses are spending more time than others trying to just keep the lights on in their organizations, keep systems running. They have fewer resources available to prioritize their transformation projects and are just a little bit slower than the others in terms of hybrid cloud adoption. The medium business segment was actually a wonderful sweet spot of companies who have more resources than a small business, but still have greater agility than enterprises. They were most aggressively pursuing cloud adoption and new technologies. we found the medium business segment to have their workloads more dispersed in many more locations between public cloud or their own locations, co-location environments, for example. When it comes to new projects, the medium businesses are more likely to prefer not to use their own infrastructure, so more so a cloud-first strategy compared to some of the other respondents. And they're also looking for service providers and companies who can help them outsource tasks specific to managing and optimizing the infrastructure that they do own in their own premises. So more agility in this group and moving a little bit faster than the others. On the enterprise side, certainly the resources are there, especially having the largest size IT teams. However, just the sprawling nature of the IT infrastructure tends to make these companies a little bit slower than what we saw in medium business, and also very challenged on right now on making sure their entire environment is being secured. So spending more time on securing IT infrastructure, these large enterprises have a much wider variety of workloads on their own infrastructure that they need to manage. So that can include machine learning, it can include DevOps, so a whole host of different types of workloads that are being deployed on their own infrastructure that teams are working on. And based on that, they're more focused on trying to find ways to help automate their IT solutions. I think that's something that they're certainly looking for vendors' help on in terms of how they can get more automation and better streamline some of the sprawling infrastructure they have. So those are just a few notes to keep in mind in terms of what we saw in terms of business sizes. When we look at the 6 industry verticals, in some areas they all responded relatively similarly. In other cases, they had some of their own unique standouts. And there's kind of a long list in the survey, but if you really boil them down, looking at respondents in the technology industry, unsurprisingly, they were by far the most advanced and had diverse infrastructure adoption. The companies in the tech industry were much more likely to already be using Kubernetes-based platforms as part of their hybrid cloud strategy, more likely to be taking advantage of edge strategy, using cloud on-ramps at co-location sites, more emphasis on hiring IT talent as well as outsourcing IT management tasks, and taking really just kind of a more advanced and aggressive strategy than others in terms of technology innovation. So not too surprising to see given the industry. On the healthcare and life sciences side, very strong emphasis on securing IT infrastructure in terms of top priorities. And also the highest, this was the vertical that had the highest prioritization of investing in IT from a corporate level. Virtually all respondents from the healthcare industry indicated that their healthcare organization was absolutely focused on prioritizing IT investments today. So certainly a focus in modernizing and securing. Still slow compared to some of the other industries in terms of shifting to public cloud resources. On the banking and financial services side, also a very high focus on security in terms of their priorities. But we also see, relative to healthcare, more opportunities for advanced computing high-performance computing, machine learning capabilities that these companies want to have on their own infrastructure within their own walls that they can use to help advance their own business while also not putting some of their sensitive data at risk. So similar to the technology industry, a little more focus on innovation within this segment, but also innovation specific to things on their own infrastructure that are being secured. With the industrials, consumer goods and services verticals, we saw these two, unsurprisingly, are farther along and more interested in prioritizing edge compute adoption. And when we looked at the use cases, expected use cases for edge compute, given those often align to, retail and manufacturing strength, we expected to see this. So while these industries are also can at times be strapped for cash or have tight budgets in terms of investments, they are certainly looking to invest in edge compute areas that will generate a return on investment. Public sector, certainly I would say, as a buyer group, acts by far the most uniquely of these 6 industry verticals that we looked at in the study. We saw, again, a significant importance on security, which tends to be the case in many verticals, but also facing some of just the unique challenges of the public sector, disproportionately affected by staffing challenges. Well, I think we see these across full industry. For public sector, this is even just a greater challenge in terms of their ability to pay and retain talent. Slowest on public cloud adoption, highest rates of centralized data center usage, high rates of running legacy applications, not very likely to be looking at edge compute, and ultimately less likely to be, I guess, farther along in terms of their own modernization objectives compared to some of the others. So, just wanted to kind of kick things off with a little bit of an overview of what we saw across business size and vertical. In terms of talking about some of the top takeaways from the study, I'll mostly keep it at an kind of overarching level, but wanted to show just some examples of how there's really some interesting variations as we go through the full survey data, and really lots to unpack there. So we'll talk through 3 of the top survey themes that were presented that are in the executive summary of this full research composition. So we'll go through each of these individually and look at a few examples of actual data points that lead into these takeaways. So first on the list, we're going to talk about what's getting in the way of strategic innovation, because I think one of the more surprising and interesting findings from this research was really just seeing how much operational challenges are still slowing down companies in terms of accomplishing the things that they'd really like to be doing. So this first chart is a great example of showing some of the pain points that the companies, regardless of size, are still facing in 2022. So looking at this list, it's top priorities for IT organizations over the next 2 years. And this is kind of a mix of some operational or necessary type of things, as well as more strategic, like business transformation projects, modernizing legacy applications, building out those hybrid clouds and multi-clouds. Ultimately, what we found was that the top 2 priorities for organizations of every single size we talked to, as well as every industry, ultimately were improving security and improving the reliability of IT systems. In some of the qualitative feedback we got from our survey respondents, respondents very often talked about the fact that even in 2022, they're still dealing with and working through increases in remote workers. It's caused just a huge proliferation of new security threats and infrastructure challenges for organizations. So these are still persisting today and really clearly having an overall impact in terms of what IT and infrastructure teams are spending their time on. They're taking precedence over things like cloud transformation, application modernization, and as part of that too, I think we see maintaining staff is also a challenge that is kind of coming into the mix here. You'll actually see that business transformation projects were second to last on the list overall in terms of top priorities that are being focused on in the next 2 years. At the same time, we saw that in our survey data, the value of the IT organization is actually recognized now more than it probably ever has been. In looking back a few years at the customer research, we would have conducted here at TBR, 5 years ago, I think if we asked customers or buyers in the IT space if their company prioritized and found IT to be a strategic investment, then maybe half of the respondents would have agreed with that 5 years ago. Today, in this survey, we found that 94% of the respondents did agree that their leadership believes that investing in IT is a priority for their organization. So this has really showed a very clear sentiment shift in terms of viewing IT as cost center to really considering it an essential part of business strategy, regardless of business size. So I think what we see here is that there are pandemic impacts that are continuing and lingering among organizations. Staffing challenges are certainly a part of that. And ultimately, that's getting a little bit in the way of organizations really focusing on what they'd like to focus on. And I think also in our data has shown just probably the great opportunity from a technological perspective, from automation, but also from a services perspective, how security strategy, ongoing maintenance, and managed services around infrastructure are things that can certainly help readjust IT organizations' priorities to really help focus on the value that companies are seeing and believing in their IT organization. But based on our data, has shown that companies, they really just need more resource to help apply to those objectives. You'll see a similar view here in terms of what were some of the top challenges for IT. So you'll see in the lighter blue side of the chart, the more significant challenges ranked from top to bottom. And then the middle blue colors of kind of different shades of how challenging some of these different aspects are. Securing IT infrastructure, automating processes, maintaining IT staff tended to be the top two challenges if you're looking at items that were ranked a challenge or significant challenge across respondents. The securing IT infrastructure, of course, not surprising given that was the very top objective we saw on the previous slide. In terms of the second two, automating processes and maintaining IT staff, those I think go a little bit hand in hand with each other in terms of automating processes are partially becoming an increased challenge due to the fact that they're really needed now more than ever. So certainly opportunities for vendors here in terms of helping customers with these challenges. And I think interestingly, we noted on the last slide, respondents told us that they're really seeing their corporate and leadership recognizing the value of IT today. You'll also see on this slide that obtaining IT funds is actually the least challenging item on the list, which is a little bit surprising. That historically has not necessarily been the case, and we see now that 16% of respondents said it's not at all a challenge, and for 40% of respondents, it's only a minor challenge to obtain the IT funds that we need. And in some of the other questions in our survey, we learned that 44% of the respondents indicated their budgets have increased as a result of COVID-19 for IT spend, versus today only 22% of the respondents were seeing budget cuts as a result of COVID-19 that were specific to IT spending, giving you roughly 35 or so percent who have stayed roughly the same. So in general, for these respondents across company sizes, we tend to see that more respondents have seen an uplift in IT spend, and that's still sustained today in 2022 as a result of COVID-19. More common than we're seeing respondents that are having to cut back on spend. That's a little bit of kind of some of the more macro view of what's going on with the IT customers we surveyed. A little bit more view into some of the more specific infrastructure investments is what we'll look at next, and just kind of some of the relationship between data center consolidation and what we still see in terms of on-premises infrastructure investments. So I think I'll start out by saying that data center consolidation is certainly prevalent, and that was backed up by survey data as well. The data is not showing on the slide here, but we saw overall across the respondents about 60% of them indicating their company will engage in some degree of consolidating the data center space that they have. So it's certainly prevalent. Despite that, respondents are still very open to running workloads on premises, and we'll see that consolidation, unsurprisingly, will be primarily achieved through shifting resources to public cloud and SaaS, as you can see on the chart here, with a 72% expecting to increase consumption of public cloud and SaaS over the next 2 years. And we certainly see, unsurprisingly, when there is consolidation, that's often where resources are moving. We also have seen that consolidation can be achieved in other ways, namely by replacing legacy hardware with more modern infrastructure. So we'll take a look at that as well on the next slide, but certainly consolidating infrastructure into more modern setups is another part of consolidation. It's not entirely about shifting workloads completely away. You'll see on this slide here as well, the centralized data centers, roughly 18% are expected to decrease in their use over the next 2 years, but a relatively large proportion are more or less keeping their consumption of those the same. We see some growth in the expected usage of infrastructure in places like edge sites or branch offices or retail sites. Again, a lot of the industrials and infrastructure and retail clients were some of the main proponents and interested in making their IT infrastructure more dispersed and increasing the amount of edge compute that they're using over the next couple of years. I think the other thing that I would just comment on before we head to the next slide would be that we also see a little bit of a shift in terms of just general mentality around new projects. So I think over the last few years, the phrase "cloud first" tended to be, very popular. Respondents, when we would either interview or survey IT buyers, they would generally say, for any new project, we're looking for a SaaS option, or we're looking for a public cloud option for this project. That's kind of what we're focused on. We saw more respondents in this survey indicating that they are taking a cloud smart approach when it comes to evaluating new projects. So I think it's a bit of a nuanced difference, but the difference really there is evaluating, all of the options on an individual project basis and not making, really a blanket statement in terms of how a company is going to address their infrastructure needs. So really more of a focus on individual project by project basis evaluation. And I think that ties into some of the consolidation and repatriation findings we'll also look at a little bit later on. So where are people investing in infrastructure over the next 2 years? Servers, unsurprisingly, if there is a place where buyers are going to start to downsize their footprint, it appears that servers are the place where that may happen. More compute shifting into public cloud resources. So we see the highest amount of downsizing server footprints relative to other types of infrastructure. But as we had also mentioned earlier, we see that part of data center consolidation for the respondents we surveyed is modernizing their infrastructure to denser infrastructure, more capable infrastructure, which also is helping to shrink those footprints. We see that storage and high-performance computing, 56% of respondents are expecting to expand their infrastructure footprint, so their own company-owned infrastructure over the next 2 years. And ultimately, with the amount of data that companies are generating and consuming, this really doesn't surprise us too much that even with additional public cloud and SaaS consumption, the amount of storage that the companies plan to invest in is ultimately still going to increase over time. And similarly, with the verticals like banking and financial services, for example, we see respondents who are looking to, conduct different types of analytics and machine learning in their own environment, using their own sensitive data. And that's another area that appears to be a priority in terms of investing in company-owned infrastructure versus things that are being shifted into a hosted environment. So the third here, cloud strategies remaining diverse, probably not the most shocking headline you've ever seen, but I wanted to cover some of the cloud findings and sentiment that we saw among our respondent base. So one thing I think we saw was that there's really not a single path to hybrid cloud, and beyond that, companies are actually following multiple paths themselves. So one of the things we were curious about with this survey was how are companies of all sizes building out hybrid cloud? Are they starting with their public cloud environments and then coming down through solutions like Azure Stack or AWS Outposts to connect to on-premise environments? Are they using third-party software? Are they buying appliances specifically designed to run hybrid cloud? Are they looking at Kubernetes adoption? So across the board, what we ultimately saw is that companies are doing at least two of the things on this list at a minimum. So there is certainly a lot going on, and even within individual companies, they're going to really use multiple types of hybrid cloud approaches and on kind of a case-by-case basis. We do see here that in terms of popularity, they're relatively similar, but public cloud providers certainly have an advantage in having familiar user interfaces and management tools that companies are used to working with. So customers do seem to favor cloud providers' offerings like Azure Stack, for example, when it comes to connecting their data or making some type of hybrid cloud. But we also see different types of third-party software and appliances also certainly having interest from customers and being deployed as well. So really quite a varied mix here. And that's probably not going to go away anytime soon, but I think we may see kind of shifts in popularity in the types of options that customers are ultimately choosing. When we look at data center consolidation, we talked about this a little bit already from an overall perspective. The 62% either somewhat or significantly planning to consolidate their data center footprint, with roughly 40% either keeping those footprints the same or expanding them. The one thing that we talked about a little bit with the medium businesses and just wanted to illustrate here is, again, that concept of this segment being a bit more agile than the other two in terms of having less sprawling infrastructure that they have to worry about, but a little bit more resource and investment power than the small businesses. So we saw more aggressive data center consolidation strategy in the medium business side. We saw more aggressive adoption of public cloud, but I think what we also saw in looking into the next slide is that we saw slightly higher rates of cloud repatriation in the medium business segment as well. So when we say cloud repatriation, we're referring to workloads that have been run in public cloud that have then ultimately been shifted back to a company's own infrastructure. So I think the medium businesses were the ones who told us they are more likely to have a cloud-first adoption strategy. By a kind of a very small margin, it appears that they also then are maybe doing some adjustments after the fact as well, just slightly higher rates of activity in cloud repatriation. So overall here, if you look at the slide, more than half of respondents have shifted workloads back from public cloud to their own infrastructure at some point. Clearly not, an insanely overwhelming trend. You see, 14% saying it happens somewhat frequently, 31% occasionally, and then 13% on a rare occasion. So certainly not a mass exodus by any means, but definitely confirming the fact that customers are open to evaluating where something's going to run best. In some cases, they may have not really had met the expectations that they were promised in a certain environment, so they're shifting their workloads around to better optimize that. I think what we found to be interesting in terms of the reasons why cloud repatriation is happening among the respondent group is, we honestly expected that cost would boil to the top as kind of a top driver of moving workloads back. We expected that customers would say, we realized we could run this specific workload at 30% less cost, so ultimately that's why we made the shift. Really the top two reasons, security concerns was still the #1 reason, followed by compliance concerns. So although in general there has been a perception shift with public cloud being seen as more trustworthy, the cloud providers themselves have certainly invested in their capabilities in these areas and certifications. There do still seem to be challenges that in some cases are causing customers to shift their workloads back to their own infrastructure. Some of the other common reasons, performance and latency issues, also another one that's caused some repatriation, as well as just having excess available capacity or looking for better control and centralization of certain assets. So overall, we see that the security and compliance is still a concern to some degree for specific workloads, although I would still say from my own perspective as an industry, I'd see that more and more frequently we see an increased level of trust in public cloud. So I think this just shows us that it's still has not been completely perfected. So that wraps up the slides that we were going to cover today. Again, the research that we've been looking at in this discussion is TBR's Infrastructure Strategy Customer Research, which just published last month, and it's available to all of our TBR IT infrastructure subscribers. So I'm certainly happy to get together and discuss this more. If there's more questions from any of the individuals or participants who joined us today, certainly feel free to reach out to me on that. And some of our related IT infrastructure research is here as well. We've been getting a lot of inquiries about our hardware subscription services market landscape that looks at as-a-service offerings like HPE GreenLake, Dell Technologies, Apex, Pure as a Service, and the like. So that's another somewhat related area where we're getting a lot of customers' questions today. So again, just feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to discuss further or learn more about those. And Haley, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Angela, and thank you everybody for joining. Please feel free, like Angela said, to reach out to her with any follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out the survey that's going to pop up on your screen. And like I said, a replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to all of you via email. To view a list of upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. And thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.